Good morning again, Chair, members of the committee. Michael Zucchet, representing the San Diego Municipal Employees Association. I failed to recognize the group that's with me this morning, including Michelle Ciccarelli, our president, and other members of MEA's leadership and staff. Appreciate them being here. I want to appreciate Matt Vespi and his team, Rolando and Ben and everybody else. They do a great job on a massive project, and what they really do well is functional communication with stakeholders, including MEA. We certainly don't agree on everything, although we agree on a lot of things. But as with most things in life, communication solves about 90% of issues, and they do that well. So I wanted to appreciate Matt and his team for that. As has been mentioned, and we don't need to be reminded about the results of the election, San Diegans, by a very thin majority, have told us that they want you to continue to operate this city with the lowest sales tax rate in the county of San Diego and one of the lowest rates in the state of California. And there are consequences to that decision. And it's up to you now to right-size the services to the revenue that we have, not the revenue that we think we should have, and the number of employees that we can afford. Next slide, please. Just wanted to talk about a few concepts for your consideration as you approach this. First and foremost is to start now. The best thing we have going for us is that there are more than 6 months left in this fiscal year with which to get going on this. And as the IBA alluded to, the more we can do now and get started on structural changes now, the better it is in the long run, and it produces more excess equity for this year, which can be used to soften the blow a little bit next year and make this more of a 18-month plan rather than a 6-month plan, because the 6-month plan is not one that anybody wants to engage in to get to structural balance in 6 months. But I think over a 2-cycle period, if we get going now, it's certainly more manageable. And as has been noted, this committee in particular, and certainly the council and the IBA, need to be a part of that process, and now. Yes, the mayor recently announced a series of measures, but frankly, we don't think they went nearly far enough. Doing a hiring freeze in the absence of any actual service cuts actually may not save money. It'll produce more vacancy savings that, based on your first quarter budget monitoring report, will just go to police and fire overtime, or maybe more program managers and program coordinators. So we need to go further. He also proposed cutting discretionary overtime. Well, first of all, there's not that much discretionary overtime, and in the places that it's used, it's needed. He proposed cutting travel. Okay, there's tens of thousands of dollars. Halting the Civic Center project, which, as Scott Lewis pointed out, doesn't cost us anything. In fact, the Previs Foundation was funding it, so I guess we're cutting money that was being given to us. And then a long list of evaluations. We're evaluating office space, evaluating new revenues, evaluating Golden Hall monetization, evaluating CIP. Guys, we gotta get going on this, and we gotta get going now. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. And so, again, given the situation, some form of a thoughtful hiring freeze, and we'll talk more about that in a second, makes sense. But you have to reduce the services that are attached to those positions. There's a lot of people taking victory laps at City Hall that our employee recruitment and retention problem has been solved, vacancies are good, everybody's good to go. That is not true with respect to MEA and 127 represented positions. We still have very significant vacancy rates. We very much appreciate the progress that we've made, and we appreciate you and your role in that, but we got a long way to go. For instance, 13% of library positions are vacant. That's 75 budgeted positions that are vacant. 65 of those are librarians and librarian assistants. We're adding new libraries. We're adding new programming. We can't staff the programs and facilities that we have now. The mayor has now shut off the spigot of new employees, and what? We're just going to continue to operate everything that we have with less people. That does two really negative things. Number one, it communicates to the public that, no problem, you're not going to be affected. We'll just cut a few positions and everything will be fine. Well, who Who provides these services? Human beings do. And if we're not providing the human beings, that's not being honest with the public. And number two, what message does that send to the employees? And as they become stretched thinner and thinner and have the inability to provide services that they would like to provide, and the public gets mad, there's this nasty feedback loop that tends to spiral downward. So we need to actually provide some direction. You need to provide some direction and be involved in the notion of cutting services, not just doing a hiring freeze. Just a few other examples. Your Parks and Recreation, MEA represented Parks and Rec positions, 25% of them are vacant. That's 142 vacancies today. This is before the hiring freeze. 60 recreation center directors and rec leaders are vacant. 25% of your park ranger positions are vacant. And you have added a significant amount of new facilities over the years, and you're about to propose more, or at least they're in your 5-year outlook. And so, you know, these something's got to give here. You've got 14% vacancy in MEA represented positions in police and fire, which is about twice the vacancy rate of sworn positions. Treasurer's office, facilities, all significant vacancy rates, and that's with today's level of services. Next slide, please. And then, as was just outlined in your 5-year outlook, there's talk about new services, new programming. In the past, you've added new departments, new facilities, libraries, fire stations, parks, dozens of parks and joint use facilities, all the personnel, equipment, vehicles, and maintenance that goes along with them. $56 million in new homeless services funding, including Hope and Vine, is apparently back and alive and well. And to the point that was made earlier, that's another bad start to this budget process. If we're communicating on the one hand how dire and doom and gloom it is, on the other hand, the party's just going to keep on going on. Something's got to give here, and this new spending that's being talked about is problematic, both in terms of messaging and the reality of what needs to be done here. Next slide, please. So there is some sort of low-hanging fruit that has been talked about. You got $250 million in general fund external contracts. Those should be immediately frozen and cut, especially any of those that don't deal with the safety and security of employees or the public. And instead of doing that, this week, the city continues to send requests for contracting out of general fund services to MEA, as recently as yesterday. So I don't know who's really looking over the operations of the city, but there's a lot of disconnects. I talked to a lot of department directors who, speaking of, you know, clear communication, aren't exactly getting clear communication. What's going on with the hiring freeze? Who can be hired? Who does it apply to? Who does it not apply to? And in the thick of all of this, we're still making requests to MEA to contract out work because we can't hire enough city employees that we just froze the hiring of and that we just cut their overtime. So obviously this is a little bit of frustration for us. Next slide, please. I'd now like to start a whole new presentation on program managers and program coordinators. Okay, that was a bad attempt at humor. Please refer to the earlier presentation. This is substantial, low-hanging fruit with which to start with. Next slide, please. Absolutely, other revenues should be pursued. The IBA just mentioned parking meters. As I understand it, this is something that can literally be done immediately. Like, you could have this in place like in January, in a matter of weeks. Rather than charging $1.25 an hour for parking and being under market by many dollars, you can charge $2.50 for parking and still be under budget to private lots and generate millions more dollars. And that's something that could be done quickly. You have a lot of fire, EMS, police contracts with the airport, with the Port of San Diego, with other cities that you provide 911 dispatch services for. Are all of those up to date? Are we capturing all of the costs in growth in this city yet? We have other external charges for services that are talked about generally in the 5-year outlook. We have internal transfers where the general fund provides services to non-general funds. Are those all up to date, and are we doing our full cost recovery there? I think there's a lot that hopefully already has been looked at there, and speed is important there. We should be looking at any new potential opportunities for revenue, like paid parking at the beach. And while that is not something that can be done by January because it involves the Coast Commission, we should start now. Because as we just talked about, this is not going to be a one and done. This is going to be a multi-budget cycle. We should also prioritize getting full cost recovery for refuse and get that implemented as soon as possible. I know there's been a lot of very thoughtful discussion about how to implement that and to phase it, but the reality is we need full cost recovery, and we need it as soon as possible. Next slide, please. Want to just talk about a few lessons from 2009, 2010, and the cuts that were done there. The first is to do no budget harm. You know, back in that situation, for instance, in the police department, there was a notion that we didn't want to lay off any sworn police officers. Okay, well, amen to that. But what did you do? You laid off more than 100 non-sworn personnel in the police department, including you literally eliminated one classification and wiped out another, that were doing police investigative aides and police service officers that were doing work that had to be done, but work that didn't have to be done by police officers. So you laid off all those positions. The work still had to be done. Who did the work? Sworn police officers who were making twice as much as the civilians that you just laid off. You're literally taking sworn police officers off the street to do work being done by civilians. And so, you know, there was a number of moves like that that were sort of head scratchers. You laid off or you cut positions for dispatchers, which produced a 911 crisis, calls holding. How did you address it? You brought in sworn police officers on overtime who already make twice as much as dispatchers to backfill the dispatchers that you cut their positions of. And so I hope things like that are thought through. You stopped hiring in the fire department, which again caused, given that you have to staff your fire apparatus, for those positions to be filled on overtime rather than with permanent employees. So you saved a little bit by canceling a fire academy. You cost yourself millions on the back end. So I'm assuming that stuff will be thought out much better than it was the last time around. The second bullet point here, this hiring freeze is tricky. Are you freezing the hiring of parking enforcement officers? Those positions generate $250,000. 30% of them are vacant today, something we've been complaining about for years. If you just filled your parking enforcement officer positions, you could actually generate an additional $5 million of net revenue to the city. But what is the hiring freeze direction to the police department? This is an honest question. I haven't had any communication with the police chief or anything. Is it clear that we're still hiring them or not? What about people in the treasurer's office and in risk management who deal with delinquencies and who are actually collecting money for the city? Does the hiring freeze apply to them? What about non-general fund? How are we handling that? So I think there's a lot more that should be done with more urgency and not just a public announcement that we're doing a hiring freeze that nobody quite understands. You know, be equitable is this third bullet point. I'm not here with any answers, but you know, there's a question. If you're going to actually keep the hiring freeze in place and reduce library and park and recreation services, how are you going to do it? Are you going to close facilities? Are you going to take a couple hours out of all the facilities? Are you going to, you know, what are the metrics? How is this going to be done? These are decisions that are being made. There's been a lot of talk this morning about preparing for FY2026. This needs to be done now, and this needs to be done by this committee. And we need to act with a little more urgency, both on the service cut side and on new revenues. Because if we don't, the solutions that we're left with are going to be even less pretty than they are today. Last slide, please. So I would repeat the plea that, and Mr. Council President, congratulations. I'm for you and the next chair of this committee, which I hope is in this room. Please docket meetings of this committee as soon as possible to really engage on these important issues. And we have to do this with the IBA and the council leading the way. Okay, thank you very much for your time.